Welcome back to today's session and the final session for the week. Some days, some weeks ago, and some other people may have experienced this, but on the motorway, there was an incident that took place. Unfortunately, someone um, decided to take their lives by suicide, and they jumped from a bridge onto the motorway and unfortunately lost their lives. They were crushed by an oncoming vehicle. The motorway was closed down for a short while, whilst um, the remains of the individual and some investigation took place with regards to what actually happened. Now, as I reminisced and as I reflected, I there's this feeling of sadness that came to my heart for many reasons. One of which is often we believe that our suffering is permanent, and we make decisions that might appear to be a way out, but doesn't necessarily mean it was the only way to resolve the issue. We see this more with men than we do with women. Here are some statistics for you. Between age, say, 10 and 14, boys and girls generally commit suicide in the UK at roughly about the same rate. Between 15 and 19, the number doubles for boys. Between 20 and 25, the number goes up to about 4.5 times. Between 25 and 35, the number jumps up to about 6 times. Between roughly 35 to about 40, 50, that number goes up to about almost 7.5 to 9 times. And what's interesting is from about 45 to 50 years up to about 90, that number goes up to roughly almost 20 times for men compared to women. Men are generally more lethal when it comes to carrying out the act of suicide than women are. Women carry out attempts more than men do. Sometimes they even attempt it at the same ratio as men. But when it comes to execution and completion, men seem to do it more often and more successfully. For women, most of the time, it's a cry for help and a useful cry. And with a lot of men believe, and part of that belief is, one might even argue, is social conditioning, and one might even argue that perhaps it's people like myself who recommend to men to take more responsibility. Nonetheless, men were more lethal in carrying out our heart's desires, especially with regards to suicide. A lot of the people who have been involved in such have had issues with depression, issues with worry, doubt, and anxiety, and issues with mental health. Now, irrespective of whether it's a male or female, no one should have to experience death in that manner. No one should have to witness such a death also in that manner. And so in today's session, perhaps as I think about what I will share in the following week, I want to talk about duty. I'm jumping the gun here because I think there are some preliminary steps that I should take in explaining context, but nonetheless, take this as it comes. Do you have a duty? Is there a duty you have to yourself? Is there a duty you have to your family? Is there a duty you have to your community, to your country? Is there a duty you have to your church, your synagogue, or any ecclesiastical authority that you might subscribe to? Is there a duty you have to God or any divine authority in your life? Now, these are questions you have to ask yourself. If the answer is no, then I guess in many ways you've just answered the question, which is that for you, it's all about relativity or relativism, or subjectivity, or even hedonistic preferences. It's all about preferences. It all comes down to the same thing, preferences. Morality, in my opinion, can only come from a transcendental pathway, a divine order, whether that be Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, whatever. There has to be something that goes beyond our preferences, because it cannot just be subjective, it has to be objective, and that objectivity comes from a value system hierarchy. Thou shalt not and thou shalt not, so we can categorize which thou shalt are much more superior to the others. Absent that, what we tend to find is people just go by their whims and their preferences. And this brings us into the whole concept of philosophies. And what you tend to find is that this hedonistic, preferential based philosophy leads us to different pathways, one of which can be the whole idea that I own myself, and therefore I can kill myself and I can take my life, and it should be nobody's business because it's my life. Very little regard is taken into account with regards to people you leave behind and people who witness said event without the right closure. And one of the things I am aware of, and especially with regards to this incident I began today's session with, is the driver of the vehicle that was involved with the deceased, recognizing that the deceased was the one who jumped out of the bridge. That driver will be scarred for life. The other vehicles that witnessed it will be scarred for life. The people who were involved in the process, whether that be the support staff, the police, will be scarred for life. One of the reasons I focus on depression, and I've spent this much time, is to show that there is another way out. That if you've been trying things in your way for a long time and you haven't found success, why don't you try what I've been sharing? And today I've covered so far 68 sessions of different ideas and different strategies and different, you might even say, normative statements and proposals and philosophies and recommendations and to-do guidelines to give you an opportunity for you to choose life. The great writer says, I've come that you may have life and have it more abundantly. In order to have that and share in that, it requires a choice. Now, nobody can force the other not to commit suicide or not to be depressed. But I strongly believe that depression can be a choice, especially those that are not clinically depressed, that we can choose. In the midst of all of our suffering, we can choose how the story ends. In sessions prior, I talked about the whole idea of never selling out. Your sins and the errors of omission and commission, mistakes you've made, no matter how heinous and disappointing it might be to you, there is some redemption. That's what the Christian ethics teaches us, that you can be forgiven. No sin is too much to be forgiven. As a matter of fact, the forgiveness process happens in an instant. And therefore, irrespective of how disappointed you might be about your decisions, your choices, your failures, your setbacks, your limitations, you find a new life when you turn that page. Not the page of life, but the page that simply says, I let go. I let go of my sins and my past. I let go of my poor decisions, and I start anew. You can be born again, to use the metaphorical statement. You can let go. You can't be born anew. And that requires a decision. But for that to work, it requires an understanding that there are duties that you owe to yourself, and there are duties you owe to other people. John F. Kennedy says, don't ask what your country can do for you, but ask, what can I do for my country, for its people? The biblical writers make reference to the fact that if you want to be the greatest, you have to be the servant. There's a necessity for you to serve other people. And we know of Zig Ziglar in his very famous words, where he said that you can have anything you want in life if you just help enough people get what they want. And the whole concept, the thread that runs through each of those sayings, is the importance of taking away from self. Self-sacrifice is not noble. Self-development, self-improvement, Self-education, self-preservation draws admiration. It draws admiration. So as we struggle with depression and we contend with this whole concept in the West that we have found ourselves surrounded by, we have to recognize that there has to be a duty that we reinstill in people's hearts, that you have a duty. You don't own yourself because you didn't create yourself. Sessions prior, I talked about purpose. There is a purpose for everything under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. There's a purpose for time. There's a purpose for season to sow and a season to reap. Everything has a purpose. There's a sequence to how things work. And if you do not understand the purpose, you abuse it. And when we come to the point of thinking that we own ourselves and we can do with ourselves what we want, and this applies to people who actually self-harm because they see it as, it's my body, it's my choice. Well, you didn't create yourself. Because if you did, you would know the purpose for which you were created. But we know that many people do not know their purpose. And because they do not know their purpose, they abuse their bodies and they abuse their souls and they abuse their lives. You have to let go and you have to let God. And one of the ways of starting that process is just choosing a duty, something greater than yourself. In the sessions that will follow, I will talk about virtues. It's a shame because in the West, what we've seen is a degenerate society that continues towards more and more degeneration. People are encouraged to embrace their vices, lust, greed, envy, gluttony, and more, pride. And people are encouraged to shun the virtues, chastity and charity and prudence and diligence, etc. And what we find is that absent virtues, the human is no different to the beast, to the sheep, to the cow, that lack a soul, or I should say that lack an intellect, and therefore they go with the whims of whatever the environment brings their way. Without virtues in your life has no meaning because it has no value. With virtues, there's meaning, there's a value, there's a hierarchy of values, there's an expectation. As I close out this week, I want you to keep in mind that there's always a way. There's always a way out. Even if you're anxious, you're depressed, you're worried, you're troubled. Being troubled and worried and anxious and disappointed, these are natural emotions and natural phenomena. The question is, what do you do about it? Do you allow it to grow? Do you suppress it and then it becomes depressive in its nature and then becomes a monster in itself that forces you towards death and destruction? Or do you share it? I would just recommend to you as I close today's session, a problem shared is a problem half solved. And sometimes don't worry too much about not having people in your vicinity to share things with. This is perhaps one of the advantages of social media. You can shout out to the world and say, I'm troubled, I need help. And in a short while, people will come around you and say, can I help you? You may lack the help and the social group locally, but globally, the love is still there. There are people who are simply looking forward to playing a part in the joy of giving, the joy of being able to invest their life in your life and their time in yours. So I would encourage you as follows as I end this week. Share it, especially for men who have a habit of not sharing their emotions. Be selective, but share it. And if you find you cannot find the right voices that can help you or the right ears that would listen, and even if you believe that there is no such thing as a transcendental, find a local parish, find a church, find a mosque, a synagogue, a place of congregation by people of like mind, Alcoholics Anonymous, and go into their midst and share your challenges, your struggles, and let the hand of God play its part in guiding you and helping you get through your Garden of Gethsemane. Next week I'll talk about people in biblical times, who went through periods of, incredible feelings of depression and unrest. We start from the very early books of the Torah,